Hayek, and General Equilibrium Analysis, by William Budous, 1985. 1. Introduction. An unanticipated outcome of the renewed interest in Austrian economics is the claim that it shares important similarities with new classical macroeconomics. This claim has been mounted in two related ways. First, Lucas and Laidler argue that the business cycle work of Hayek and Mises during the 1920s and 1930s is a precursor to contemporary equilibrium business cycle theory. Second, Kullander and Guthrie and Cantor suggest that the rational expectations hypothesis resembles an Austrian theory of expectations. Together, these interpretations suggest a degree of correspondence between Austrian and new classical macroeconomics not heretofore generally acknowledged by contemporary Austrian economists. Indeed, Austrians are usually at pains to emphasize a distinct Austrian point of view. Given the increased frequency of claims to the contrary, the rationale for a well-defined Austrian research program is called into question. The aim of this paper is to assess the correspondence between Hayek's business cycle studies and the equilibrium approach to business cycles favored by Lucas, Sargent, Wallace and others. Since the claim advanced by Lucas and Laidler refers only to Hayek's work in the 1920s and 1930s, I shall investigate their claim by restricting references to Hayek from the same period. In Section 2, I overview the equilibrium business cycle theory of new classical macroeconomics, provide exegetical evidence pertaining to Hayek's early cycle studies, and discuss Hayek's notion of equilibrium. Section 3 probes the status of equilibrium theory in Hayek's early work and new classical macroeconomics. In Section 4, I summarize the main conclusions of the paper. 2. Equilibrium business cycle theory. The dominant price-theoretic research program of the last several decades that continues to be accepted as the core of neoclassical economics is general equilibrium analysis. Its modern development, typically credited to the Lausanne School, builds upon the significant insight that a system of social cooperation based on the division of labor is characterized by a network of interrelated markets. In the hands of Arel, Hahn, Debreu, and others, this concept was formalized by the specification of a decentralized exchange system with well-behaved production sets, preference structures and rules of price adjustment which demonstrated the mathematical possibility of pre-reconcilable choice. A price vector was shown to exist such that if agents pursued their plans in accordance with that vector, the market would generate those same prices. In this way, a set of relative prices could be determined that would generate mutually consistent plans. The carrying over of Walrasian general equilibrium analysis as the appropriate framework for monetary macroanalysis constituted a significant development for at least two reasons. On the one hand, it led some to the conclusion that the basic Walrasian equilibrium model could not provide a framework for the analysis of Keynesian-type problems, such as unemployment and quantity adjustments. Inconsistency between the theoretical implications of static general equilibrium and observed magnitudes was broached in a variety of ways, including the specification of adjustment parameters in econometric studies, attempts to construct non-auctioneer general equilibrium models, and explorations of the implications of money in Walrasian systems. Alternatively, and more to the point for this paper, the adoption of an explicitly Walrasian theoretical framework provided the basis for the new classical macroeconomics of Lucas, Sargent, Wallace, and others. This line of research is motivated by the attempt to explain deviations from the natural rate of unemployment and output while at the same time retaining the postulates that markets continuously clear and that individuals act in their self-interest. Derivative from the first postulate is the treatment of market phenomena as a sequence of Walrasian temporary equilibria in which the determination of current prices is contingent upon forecasts of future prices. At any moment a set of prices exists which equates supplies and demands given price expectations about the future. The vector of equilibrium prices determined in the current period must, however, accord with individuals' price forecasts by the second postulate, since competitive equilibrium disallows the persistence of unexploited profit opportunities from one period to the next. In artificial systems subject to changes in tastes, technology, policy rules, and exogenous shocks, the construction of models that satisfied both postulates continuously would follow a stochastic process and at the same time always be in equilibrium. It is in this sense that new classical macroeconomists describe theirs as an equilibrium theory of the business cycle. In reconciling the apparent inconsistency between such models and observed time series, for example, in connection with labor markets, new classical macroeconomists deny that a rapprochement is necessary. Rather, as Lucas notes, disequilibrium phenomena, including involuntary unemployment, are observationally meaningless. In equilibrium business cycle models, the concepts of excess demands and supplies play no observational role and are identified with no observed magnitudes. The insistence on constructing models of the business cycle which require markets to continuously clear, carries with it the implication that observed cyclical phenomena reflect voluntary, optimizing, behavior of individuals. The new classical conception of rationality which motivates these propositions, and which contrasts sharply with Haig's views discussed in Section 3, does not differentiate between the rationality of agents and that of the economic system. Since rational agents behave as if they know how the system works, a non-Pareto optimal outcome is irrational for the system and for the agents who comprise it. To proceed otherwise, it is claimed, requires the abandonment of the core of modern economics by the introduction of behavioral irrationality and with it any semblance of scientific constraint. It is this insistence to purge rules of thumb and ad hoc assumptions from theoretical constructs which helps to clarify the new classical methodological critique of Keynesian macro models. For equilibrium business cycle theorists, this primarily means that the techniques employed in theoretical and applied research be revamped in accordance with the underlying behavioral postulates. According to Lucas and Sargent, the aim of the new classical macroeconomics is to discover a particular, econometrically testable equilibrium theory of the business cycle, one that can serve as the foundation for quantitative analysis of macroeconomic policy. Bringing the subjective into line with the restrictions imposed by the core postulates has generated a macroeconometric language that increasingly dominates the character of discourse in macroeconomic theory and policy. In this manner, the equilibrium business cycle approach reflects important changes in the admissible array of assumptions about markets and individual behavior theorists may use to construct models and, perhaps more decisively, in the way researchers actually do applied macroeconomics. Thus, new classical macroeconomics has fomented changes in econometric technique that simultaneously challenge the legitimacy of earlier econometric models but which, on the other hand, remain fundamentally consistent with the implicit and widespread acceptance of an instrumentalist view of economic science. In describing an artificial economy as following a stable stochastic process and then claiming the model's robustness to explain observed aggregate time series, new classical macroeconomics attempts to forge linkages between logical and historical time. Among the new classical implications of this attempted unification between models of time and actual economies in time, the tendency has been to treat the business cycle as a monetary phenomenon arising from non-systematic policymaker rules. Treating the cause of cycles as originating from monetary disturbances suggests possible doctrinal linkages with the pre-Keynesian cycle theory of Hayek. Lucas argues that such a connection exists and claims that adherence to Walrasian general equilibrium analysis is an important thread common to both. Recently, Latham has also suggested that new classical macroeconomics is reminiscent of the Austrian business cycle theory of the 1920s and 1930s, and that is no accident. It is the Austrians who are the predecessors of Lucas, Sargent and their associates. In support of his claim, Lucas quotes from Hayek's monetary theory and the trade cycle, and I shall do likewise, though more extensively. We cannot superimpose upon the system of fundamental propositions comprised in the theory of equilibrium, a trade cycle theory resting on unrelated logical foundations. All the phenomena observed in cyclical fluctuations, particularly price formation and its influence on the direction and the volume of production, have already been explained by the theory of equilibrium. They can only be integrated as an explanation of the totality of economic events by means of fundamentally similar constructions. Later, Hayek remarks that the basis of his work is the incorporation of cyclical phenomena into the system of economic equilibrium theory, with which they are in apparent contradiction, and which remains the crucial problem of trade cycle theory. In making his case for an exogenous monetary disturbance as a cause for the business cycle, Hayek observes, there is a fundamental difficulty inherent in all trade cycle theories which take as their starting point an empirically ascertained disturbance of the equilibrium of the various branches of production. This difficulty arises because, in stating the effects of that disturbance, they have to make use of the logic of equilibrium theory. Yet this logic, properly followed through, can do no more than demonstrate that such disturbances of equilibrium can only come from outside, that is, that they represent a change in the economic data and that the economic system always reacts to such changes by its well-known methods of adaptation, that is, by the formation of a new equilibrium. In a footnote attached to equilibrium theory in the passage quoted above, Hayek says, by equilibrium theory we here primarily understand the modern theory of the general interdependence of all economic quantities, which has been most perfectly expressed by the Lausanne School of Theoretical Economics. Hayek's statements constitute persuasive evidence in support of Lucas's claim. There appears little doubt that in monetary theory and the trade cycle Hayek associated himself with the theory of equilibrium developed by Walras. Moreover, as seen from the passages quoted above, he was prepared to investigate business cycle phenomena by attempting to integrate them into equilibrium theory. For Hayek, general equilibrium theory represents both the starting point for further analysis and a strategy to ground theoretical research in order to avoid the prevailing skepticism as to the possibility of any economic theory of the trade cycle, a skepticism which may seriously retard the development of theoretical research. In this connection, it is important to note that the chapter in which the above-quoted passages appear is primarily concerned with establishing the deficiencies of measurement without theory. In other words, Hayek's objective is to emphasize the necessity of theoretical, as opposed to statistical, research as a precondition for advancement in understanding the causes and relationships embedded in business cycles. In monetary theory and the trade cycle, Hayek evidently uses the term equilibrium theory in its static sense, but it is equally telling that Hayek's notion of equilibrium undergoes substantial revision during the 1930s. In the pure theory of capital, Hayek continued his business cycle studies, albeit at the foundational level of pure theory. He argues there that the theory of capital must deal with general equilibrium because capital problems necessarily arise under interdependencies of different industries. Nevertheless, Hayek eschews the concept of stationary equilibrium since, What we need is a theory which helps us to explain the interrelations between the actions of different members of the community before the material structure of productive equipment has been brought to a state which will make an unchanging, self-repeating process possible. Aware that stationary equilibrium is not useful for the problems in question, Hayek adopts a non-stationary concept of equilibrium as a means to bridge the void between statics and dynamics, the latter being the ultimate goal of all economic analysis in explaining causation of historical sequences. For Hayek, the concept of equilibrium can be applied to non-stationary conditions in which mutually consistent plans prevail because individuals correctly foresee others' actions. Under correct foresight, Hayek observes, it would be possible to trace a sequence over time of any change in plans, whether such change derived from tastes, technology, or exogenous factors. In the context of Hayek's business cycle analysis, the sequential conception of equilibrium may be employed to trace the effects of an unanticipated increase in the supply of credit entering the commercial loan market. Like contemporary equilibrium models of the business cycle, in Hayek's system the market clears at the end of each period in the sequence. Nevertheless, this process in Hayek's theory is not sustainable. The induced activity brought on by the expansion of credit implies the pursuit of inconsistent plans. The realization of plans is subverted and it is the rectification of plans in accordance with the underlying data which returns the system to a sustainable equilibrium. Thus, while the movement of the system over the cycle is analyzed from an equilibrium vantage point, the process to which the tools of equilibrium analysis are applied is conceived as one of non-equilibrium. As such, Hayek's application of equilibrium analysis to a disequilibrium process can, I suggest, be interpreted as an attempted reconciliation between problems known to be dynamic yet whose treatment is constrained by the tools available to analyze them. If correct, this interpretation would suggest that evidence might be found in Hayek's early cycle work indicating the limitations of equilibrium analysis. It is to this question that I now turn. 3. The status of equilibrium. Among modern Austrians, much controversy surrounds whether Hayek's use of equilibrium analysis is either successful or legitimate. Yet, before this claim is addressed, and I shall not attempt it here, it would seem sensible to explore the status which the early Hayek affords to equilibrium analysis. I believe it is in this regard that important distinctions between Hayek and modern equilibrium business cycle theorists are mainly to be found. New classical economists emphasize technical accomplishments as the decisive element in making economics scientific. 3 components comprise this view of science. The first, following Lucas, identifies the nature of an economic theory as an explicit set of instructions for building a parallel or analog system, a mechanical, imitation economy. This suggests that a theory requires the specification of ideas into a formal mathematical system and that theorizing is the praxis of constructing artificial systems. The second component views theory in the sense of Lucas as constrained by technique. Technique enables the transformation of theory into formalized structures. If a theory cannot be so rendered, the reality to which it refers has no specifiable analog and thus cannot be scientifically analyzed. The third component of the new classical view of science refers to the empirical content of an analog system in accounting for movements in aggregate time series data. Presumably, predictive success constitutes the criterion for theoretical achievement for new classical macroeconomists and in this sense is no different from mainstream monetary macroeconomics. Nevertheless, new classical macroeconomists have effected important technical changes in this area, especially in treating aggregate time series data as random variables. The replacement of deterministic with probabilistic structures means that the parameters of a regression model describe a stochastic process. together with the hypothesis that agents' forecasts reflect unbiased estimates of the true model. The stochastic process generates a notion of macroequilibrium in which all deviations from trend have to be accounted for by random shocks or policy surprises. In this new classical view of science, techniques, both mathematical and econometric, define the boundaries and possibilities of economic analysis. For this reason, new classicists are effectively obliged to engage in the construction and econometric testing of equilibrium business cycle models, since alternative models or approaches cannot satisfy the formal rigor they insist upon. In short, new classical macroeconomists see equilibrium analysis as the fundamental and a present-only framework adequate for generating the growth of scientific economics. For Hayek, on the other hand, there is a clear sense of the limitations of equilibrium analysis. In this way, the common adherence to equilibrium analysis found in Hayek and Lucas et al. Tends to disguise more fundamental differences related to their respective views of science. But somewhat differently, new classical economists limit their conceptualization by the techniques available, while for Hayek the conceptualization of a problem points to the limitations of the available techniques. In Hayek's work during the 1930s, this interpretation finds support in two areas. First, in the relationship between equilibrium theory and monetary theory, and, second, in the informational requirements presupposed by equilibrium theory. By the end of the 1930s, this first area recedes as a topic of central concern for Hayek, although it is true that the Pure Theory of Capital was published in 1941, while the latter broadly concerning knowledge forms the starting point for his interdisciplinary work during the 1940s and afterward. In Monetary Theory and the Trade Cycle, Hayek draws attention to the deficiency of equilibrium theory to explain why a general disproportionality between supply and demand should arise. The solution to this problem, Hayek notes, is not to be found by changes originating within the equilibrium construct nor by the methods of equilibrium analysis, since the essential means of explanation in static theory is the assumption that prices supply an automatic mechanism for equilibrating supply and demand. In resolving the dilemma between equilibrium theory and the disequilibrium associated with business cycles, Hayek argues that it is only the introduction of money that can provide a new determining cause capable of explaining the difference between the course of events described by static theory and the actual course of events. The introduction of money, Hayek tells us, does away with the rigid interdependence and self-sufficiency of the closed system of equilibrium and makes possible movements which would be excluded from the latter. In these remarks by Hayek we find recognition that the equilibrium framework cannot by itself form the foundation for a theory of business cycles. An exogenous element, according to Hayek, must be specified to meet cycle theory's special tasks. Hayek, it appears, is suggesting an essential difference between equilibrium theory and monetary theory. His explicit intent to superimpose the latter upon the former highlights Hayek's awareness of their differences. Whether, or the extent to which, Hayek's resulting cycle analysis is useful is a separate question. Nevertheless, his recognition that equilibrium theory and monetary theory constitute two branches which need to be integrated represents a sense of the limits of general economic theory not evident in modern equilibrium business cycle theory. My remarks perhaps come into somewhat sharper relief if we examine Hayek's discussion of neutral money in the appendix to Lecture 4, Prices and Production. In general, neutral money is employed by Hayek to describe a monetary economy that has achieved a constellation of relative prices as if money were not present. It would involve an economy fully specifiable by equilibrium theory. In reflecting on the suitability of the neutral money concept as an objective of monetary policy, Hayek says, the term points, of course, only to a problem, and does not represent a solution. The necessary starting point for any attempt to answer the theoretical problem seems to me to be the recognition of the fact that the identity of demand and supply, which must necessarily exist in the case of barter, ceases to exist as soon as money becomes the intermediary of the exchange transaction. The problem then becomes one of isolating the one-sided effects of money which will appear when, after the division of the barter transaction into separate transactions, one of these takes place without the other complementary transaction. In this sense, demand without corresponding supply, and supply without a corresponding demand, evidently seem to occur. Of particular interest is the set of conditions Hayek mentions which would have to be satisfied for money to be neutral. According to Hayek, it is quite conceivable that a distortion of relative prices and a misdirection of production by monetary influences could be avoided if, firstly, the total money stream remained constant, and secondly, all prices were completely flexible, and thirdly, all long-term contracts were based on a correct anticipation of future price movements. However, Hayek observes, in order to preserve, in the case of a money economy, the tendencies toward a stage of equilibrium which are described by general economic theory, it would be necessary to secure the existence of all the conditions which the theory of neutral money has to establish. It is very probable that this is practically impossible. As I have already suggested, Hayek's work on knowledge during the 1930s and to the present provides insights into the status he attributes to equilibrium theory. While his ideas have evolved and his arguments sharpened over the course of a long career, there is in the expanse of Hayek's work a band of continuity which has an important bearing on the question under consideration here. Although the domains and specific issues Hayek has dealt with have changed, they all deal with the problem of constraints on what we can know and the corresponding investigation of mental processes and social mechanisms and institutions which arise to overcome such informational difficulties. There is little doubt that Hayek's work after World War II moved increasingly and explicitly in this direction. It is less clear, however, and certainly less agreement among researchers, if his work during the 1930s gives evidence of this theme, and if so, what relationship it might share with his views on equilibrium theory. As early as 1933 in Price Expectations, Monetary Disturbances and Malinvestments, Hayek draws attention to the increasing awareness of the conditions and limitations of the applicability of the equilibrium concept to analyze causal, time-dimensioned, processes. He suggests that some of these difficulties may be addressed by making very definite assumptions about the attitude of persons toward the future and, as noted earlier, postulates perfect foresight as a useful starting point for the analysis of capital problems. At the same time, however, Hayek stresses in that essay a distinction in the concept of equilibrium based on assumptions regarding the division of knowledge. If applied to the economic activities of an isolated person or of a centrally directed communist system, the concept of equilibrium probably has a definite meaning. While in this case we can legitimately speak of a necessary equilibrium between the decisions which a person will make at a given moment, it is much less clear in what sense we can apply the same concept to the actions of a great number of persons, whose successive responses to the actions of their fellow beings necessarily take place in time, and which can be represented as a timeless relationship only by means of unrealistic special assumptions. In the analysis of an isolated person or centrally planned economy, the problem of the division of knowledge does not arise. Equilibrium has a special meaning here because there is, by assumption, only one plan. A few years later, Hayek returned to this fundamental issue in Economics and Knowledge by contrasting the tautologies. A formal equilibrium analysis, what he calls the pure logic of choice, with the analysis of the interactions of a number of different individuals. Haig defines equilibrium among individuals as involving mutually compatible plans and claims an established equilibrium will continue provided individuals' foresight of external data and if others' plans is correct. The concept of equilibrium applied to social phenomena thus has definite meaning for Haig. It also, in his view, has usefulness only if on empirical grounds a tendency toward equilibrium exists. These points, spelled out in Economics and Knowledge, are also present in his Price Expectations paper of 1933. The explicit innovation which Haig introduces in the former is that the concept of social equilibrium has relevance only insofar as we are able to fill those formal propositions with definite statements about how knowledge is acquired and communicated. The problem of the production, acquisition, and distribution of knowledge arises for Haig because knowledge is not held in one place or by an omniscient being. Instead, knowledge is dispersed. According to Haig, the really central problem of economics is how the spontaneous interaction of a number of people, each possessing only bits of knowledge, brings about a state of affairs in which prices correspond to costs, etc., and which could be brought about by deliberate direction only by somebody who possessed the combined knowledge of all these individuals. In one sense the kind of knowledge which Haig has in mind is far broader than that typically incorporated into economic models. In addition to prices, quantities, and price expectations, it also refers to all sorts of detailed, practical knowledge available to individuals as well as knowledge of general rules of behavior, traditions, and social customs that may be largely tacit. Yet, in contrast to new classical macroeconomists, Haig does not maintain that such knowledge is of the relevant economic theory as Muth suggests, or that it refers to knowledge of the economy's structure. For Haig, scientific knowledge is not the only kind that is relevant or the sum of all knowledge since there exists a domain of unorganized knowledge of the particular circumstance of time and place which practically every individual has more advantage over all others. That the division of this kind of knowledge precludes detailed structural knowledge of the economy finds expression in Haig's claim that production is governed by prices, independently of any knowledge of the whole on the part of individual producers. The kind of knowledge agents would need to generate both individual and systemic rationality is not available to Hegelian agents. As a result, this system as a whole may be irrational, in the sense of Pareto suboptimal, even though individuals are acting rationally on the basis of the kind of knowledge they possess. In describing the relevant knowledge necessary for a tendency toward equilibrium to exist, Haig says it is the knowledge which an individual is bound to acquire in view of the position in which he originally is, and the plans which he then makes. Individuals, thus, learn as they act and it is such learning which promotes the tendency toward equilibrium. If, on the other hand, the opportunity to learn is thwarted, there may still be the prospect of equilibrium but it is not one which could be regarded as a sort of optimum position. Thus Haig's conception of equilibrium involves a tendency relative to that knowledge which people will acquire in the course of their activity. If a change in data arises, which falls outside the sphere of equilibrium analysis, this would mean that equilibrium analysis can really tell us nothing about the significance of such changes in knowledge, and it would also go far to account for the fact that pure analysis seems to have so extraordinarily little to say about institutions, such as the press, the purpose of which is to communicate knowledge. To sum up regarding the early Haig on knowledge and equilibrium analysis, we find that important distinctions arise between the analysis of the logic of choice and the analysis of interacting individuals. Most particularly, in the latter the problem of the division of knowledge intrudes. This implies that dispersed knowledge must somehow be transmitted and coordinated by social mechanisms if a tendency toward equilibrium is to prevail. Thus, While accepting on empirical ground the tendency toward equilibrium, Hayek redirects economic analysis away from equilibrium analysis per se toward questions which turn on the process by which knowledge is acquired and communicated. As we have seen, the relevant knowledge Hayek alludes to is not complete, but processively gained by action, does not imply Pareto optimal results, and cannot always be built into formal equilibrium constructs. 4. Conclusions. The main conclusion regarding a similarity between the early Hayek and current equilibrium business cycle theorists is that the claim is correct but misleading. I have presented exegetical evidence from Hayek cycle studies that unmistakably establishes the correspondence Lucas and Laidler emphasize. In the process of probing a bit further, however, the similarity appears to be superficial, although there is no evidence which suggests that Hayek did, or desired to, extricate himself entirely from equilibrium analysis. Yet, there is an awareness in Hayek's early work that whatever advantages might be gained, the use of equilibrium analysis also presented obstacles to a deeper understanding of fundamental economic issues. In this sense, Hayek's early work reflects a subtle tension between the perceived necessity of stating his case in a theoretically acceptable fashion, that is, equilibrium theory, and a sense of that theory's limitations. I have argued that Hayek's mild discomfort with equilibrium theory is evident, though not prominent, in his work of the early 1930s. Thereafter, his uneasiness appears to strengthen, and by 1937 in Economics and Knowledge the disquietude assumes definite contours. While Hayek continues to think in terms of tendencies toward equilibrium, the kinds of questions that appear central to him push his research in epistemic directions and further away from equilibrium theorizing. This interpretation provides clear areas of difference between the early Hayek and contemporary equilibrium business cycle theorists. Hayek, in a sense, starts out by constructing an equilibrium model of the business cycle but ends up in 1937 with a different set of issues, concerns, and a new research agenda. Alternatively, new classical macroeconomists start out by rejecting the neoclassical synthesis, work their way back to Walras, and end up with an equilibrium theory of the business cycle. Thus, Lucas and others are correct to see in the early Hayek important similarities with their own work. They do not see, however, that what for them is an objective was for Hayek a beginning. In speculating on this apparent new classical misinterpretation of Hayek, it is plausible that Lucas and Laidler have mistakenly dichotomized Hayek's work into technical economics and other areas. Into the former category is placed the early business cycle monographs and into the latter everything else. The problem with their interpretation of the early Hayek is not that they misread Hayek. Rather, they fail to realize that his work in other areas has a great deal to say, if only indirectly, about Hayek's overall perspective and his business cycle studies in particular. As suggested by Gray and Weimer, Hayek's work across several domains is unified by the theme of constraints on knowledge. Interpreters who overlook this run serious risks of misinterpreting Hayek. For this reason, it is important to emphasize that a more complete assessment of the similarities between Hayek and new classical macroeconomics would involve at least two additional projects. First, an account of Hayek's work after World War II is essential for a full and fair treatment of his scientific output. Second, Hayek's theory of expectations and its proximity to rational expectations are areas in which added illumination is sorely needed.